So eight years ago, I was in Nantucket with a group of friends, and I had worked in fashion. I was a lawyer. I was a talent agent and all the things. And the child separation policy had happened, and I was so heartbroken, and I wanted to help fix something. And I kept being told that we need higher voter turnout. So I was determined that I was going to solve that issue. I really had that like legally blonde, like what, like it's hard moment when I was like, yeah, of course, I've won so many mascaras, I can get everyone to vote. So we were in Nantucket and we were having this conversation, and my dear friend Deborah Messing was like, what do you know what you're doing? I was like, zero, literally no idea what I'm doing. And she's like, well, who do you want to talk to? And I said, I mean, my dream would be Shannon Watts. I had followed her. She was like the goat of all goats for me. And she's like, well, I'll just DM her. We'll see what happens. And I was like, that's like saying I want to be a fashion designer and I'm going to call Tom Ford. Like, you're not going to get Shannon Watts on the phone. And so, I don't know. Dad DMs her. 2 days later, my husband who's here, we were at the airport in Nantucket with the kids, and my phone rings, and it's like, hi, Mandana, it's Shannon Watts.
That is not my voice.
100% it's your voice. I drop my bags, and this is like Oprah calling me. Like, I was like, oh my God. So I was like, my kids are insane. They're running around. They're about to kill each other. Can we please chat in a few days? So a few days later, we get on the phone, and I tell her my plans and my dreams for building I'm a Voter, and that I had assembled this amazing group of 25 women. But I was like, I genuinely don't know what I'm like. I know how to build businesses and I know all the things, but I don't know how to build a movement. And she was like, you were made for this moment. You are more than qualified. You're going to do this, and I'm going to do it with you. And I'd never met this human. And she was like, call me with whatever you need. And I was like, is it weird? We're like 25 women. None of us have worked. And she's like, every good thing that has ever happened started with a group of women. She was like, just keep going. And I don't know, like, it's so hard to articulate how important it is to hear from someone like her, those words, but it was everything to me. So then I made her be my best friend, and then we did all these things together, and I made her a voter, and I make her join the board of everything that I do. And so we're here now. Anyway, so I'm really excited to talk about this book because I feel like I've gotten so much of this wisdom throughout our friendship because she's my phone a friend on literally everything. And it was so funny because I was reading your book and you had all these beautiful metaphors about fires. And there's one thing I kept thinking about, which is like one of the most beautiful powers of fire, or like a spark, is that when you light another spark, it never dims your light, right? Like you never lose your fire when you light more fires. Like it just makes the world brighter. And you never come from this place of scarcity. You're always just like, I'm going to help more women and the world will be better and brighter, which is really cool. And also you're a New York Times bestseller, which I know wasn't that we all were like hoping would happen. And a major, major shout out to Maria Shriver for making this all possible.
Thank you, Maria.
The other goat.
the first goat, the original goat.
So I'm going to try to like be more formal because this is like talking to my best friend on the phone, but we'll actually talk about the book. So I guess maybe start at Moms Demand Action and how, and obviously you were a mother of 5, you had this career in communications, you had climbed the corporate ladder, and you have this big moment. Maybe if you can just share with everyone your journey into activism.
Yeah. Bad timing. I had a whole lifetime of experiences and kind of trying to figure out who I was and what I wanted to be. And I talk in the book about how, I ended a marriage and I ended a career, and I was taking a 5-year break. We were blending a family of 5 kids, 2 of whom were here in the front row. And they were ranging in age, I think, from 7 to 18 at the time. And so I took this break and I tried a lot of different things that failed, businesses, and just sort of experimented with things. And what I didn't realize was I was building through this formula that's in the book of how to live on fire, marrying your abilities, your values, and desires. And I was slowly getting there. And I was at home. I lived in suburban Indiana in 2012. It was a very cold day. And I had a whole pile of clothes on the bed in the bedroom. And I had the TV on in the background. And suddenly I saw breaking news that there was an active shooter inside a school in Newtown, Connecticut. And like I'm sure many of you in this room, I just sort of stopped what I was doing and spent the next many hours watching this unfathomable tragedy unfold, right? That 20 children and 6 educators could be slaughtered in the sanctity of an American elementary school was just sort of too much to bear. And I went to bed in tears. At some point in the middle of the night, that sadness turned into abject rage. I woke up and I just knew after watching what happened in Columbine and Virginia Tech and Gabby Giffords and on, that no one would do anything. And so I thought, well, someone has to do something. And it made me think of when I was in high school and Mothers Against Drunk Driving was so influential. I don't know if you remember, but I can remember being in my math class and looking out the window, and this group of like badass women were hauling a crashed car onto the high school grounds. You know, they were sending a very strong message to the alcohol lobby. And I thought, we need that for gun safety. You know, how do we create moms and women who would go up against this huge special interest? And so I was standing in my kitchen and I went to my computer. Facebook was a very big deal in 2012 with middle-aged women.
How many friends did you have on Facebook?
75. I kept a very curated list of friends. And in fact, I called it, I decided to start the page called 1 Million Moms for Gun Control until my kid, who's gay, said 1 Million Moms is an anti-gay group trying to get Ellen DeGeneres not to be the spokeswoman of JCPenney. And then I got a call from a congresswoman who said, we would love to stand with you, but not if you have the words gun control in your name. So that was a very good learning experiences, which is don't name an organization without a focus group. So, you know, that was really the genesis. It was like lightning in a bottle, where the good news about having all of your information out there is type A women will track you down. They will send you emails. They will call you. They will send you direct messages and say, how do I do this where I live? The bad thing about being a public, having your information out in public is that so will gun extremists. You know, they will start making threats of death and sexual violence to you immediately, which is what happened too. And that was really the genesis of the organization. We thought we were going to have marches and rallies, and we ended up organizing so we could go toe-to-toe with the NRA.
I mean, you've written a book on activism, which is so important, because I think there's so many steps in that I think so many of us I feel like, and we'll get to this later, but that idea of like, well, what's the first step? Because it's so daunting. It feels so big. And I remember having so many of those conversations with you early on, of just feeling like, how do I ground this in just like the next step? And so thinking about you in that moment in your kitchen and watching this unfold, and you're just tackling this, and I don't know how many people know about you and how much you are like just such an introvert, and how much you hate public speaking, and you know, you have real ADHD, and you know, how did that make you afraid of taking those steps? Do you feel like those things helped you?
I think that is the importance of the FIRE formula that's in the book. When you figure out what your abilities, what your values, what your desires are, they're unique to everyone, right? And so when I started Moms Demand Action, my abilities were that I had a 10-year career in corporate communications. You know, I cut my teeth at General Electric. I knew how to create a brand. I knew how to tell a story. I knew how to write messaging. That was my skill set. And it was activism is just storytelling at the end of the day. And so, you know, those were my abilities, my values in 2012 when I was 41, you know, protecting my kids and my community. And my desire was to be a part of a badass army of women who took on the most powerful, wealthy special interest that ever existed. Now, all of that said, I knew nothing about organizing. I knew nothing about the legislative process. I knew nothing about gun violence. I had debilitating ADHD, which I had my whole life. I barely made it through high school. I barely made it through college. And I had a debilitating fear of public speaking. If you told me that Moms Demand Action would involve public speaking, I would not have started the Facebook page. Absolutely would not have. That's how much it scared me. And, you know, to have all those things come together, you know, I'm not a unicorn. I'm not someone people would look at and say, oh, that woman should take on the most powerful, wealthy special interest that's ever existed. And yet I was exactly the right person for the job.
But also you taught yourself those things, right? It wasn't like, oh, you were bequeathed these skills at birth. It was like, how did you do that? How did you learn? How did you get to that place? Because you're on TV all the time. You're giving speeches in front of people all the time. You're rallying all these women. And I know when we're about to walk into a party, Shannon is like, I'm not going to talk to any, you know, she's like stand by. She's like, I'm the buffer woman sometimes. So it's like, how do you get from that to, sure, I'm going to rally this troop of, you know, 500 women that just showed up?
I do think it was this alchemy of my abilities, values, and desires coming together. I was so passionate. I'm not a gun violence survivor. I've never been impacted by gun violence, except like we all are in America, right? That we are constantly exposed to this vicarious trauma. I think my ADHD actually helped. I mean, for 11 years, I worked on this issue 7 days a week, 15 hours a day sometimes. Every single vacation I've ever had has been, in the last 11 years, has been impacted by a mass shooting tragedy of some kind or another. But I would just go into this rabbit hole and not come out. And I think the ADHD was a big part of that. In terms of public speaking, the more you do it, the more your body gets used to it. I would have this fight or flight reaction in those early days. My hands would be shaking so much that I couldn't hold a cup of coffee. I feel now like I could go speak extemporaneously to thousands of people and my heart probably wouldn't even skip a beat just because I've gotten used to it. And I think it's really about flying the plane as you build it. I talk to so many women who feel like I've got to cross every T and dot every I before I do anything. Brilliant women who have amazing ideas, who just don't want to get started or can't figure out what that first step is. And really, that's the point of the book, which is just to take that first step, to figure out what your abilities, values, and desires are. And then as you start to move forward, understanding it's not going to be perfect. You might fail, right? If that's the worst thing that can happen is that you fail, then you've just learned something to figure it out for the next time. And that is what I learned through Moms Demand Action, is that we are all leaders. All women are leaders.
I remember when I started, I'm a voter, and I'm a brand person, so I build brands, and we'd assembled these people. We had partnered with CAA. We had done all this work, and the brand was sick, and we had all this merch and all these events, and we were ready to launch. And I got asked to speak on my first civic engagement panel, and I literally was like, I don't know one thing about voting. I just know that it's a thing that we have to get done. And I was like, I know it has to happen, but I actually don't know any voting laws. And I'd been 6 months down this road and forgot that one. I remember calling you and you were like, no, you can learn this. You can do this. You went to law school. But it's if I had known that I needed to feel like I was an expert on that, I don't know that I would have gone down that road either. But I'm so happy you brought that up because, when I think about Moms Demand Action, I always think about the largest grassroots movement in American history. I think about, defeating 90% of bad and rape. All these massive achievements that probably nobody thought was possible when you started this 10 years ago. But I think what's so beautiful is how you also talk about the failures and what you learned and the term failing forward, which I know you talk about. So can you share a little bit about that?
When you take on the most powerful, wealthy special interests that's ever existed, you're going to lose, and you're probably going to lose a lot. And we knew in those early days that if people felt like when they got involved, it wasn't worth their time, we would lose them as volunteers. And what we saw that was interesting was that, it isn't hard to get people to come into an organization when there are so many mass shootings and lockdown drills in this country. It is hard to retain them, no matter what the issue is. And yet we had this amazing retention rate, and we were growing exponentially. We eventually got to 11 million supporters, I think is where we're at right now. And we decided to pull our volunteers. Why do you stay? Why do you keep showing up? And I think this information is actually applicable broadly to life. They told us two things. The first thing was they felt like they were winning. When people feel like they're winning because you're celebrating every single win, right? You stopped a bad bill, that is still a win. When you phrase or you position losing as losing forward, this idea that maybe you lost a legislative battle, but you grew your chapter, or you made new relationships with lawmakers, you learned something to win the next time, then everything feels like a win, right? And if you're not in the weeds of the gun safety movement, maybe it feels like it's futile. We passed over 500 good gun laws. We stopped the NRA's agenda 90% of the time every year for over the last 12 years. We elected thousands of gun sense candidates to office, including our own volunteers, Representative Lucy McBath, Representative Abigail Spanberger, all these amazing women. And so if you're not in the weeds, you might not feel that, but our volunteers knew that their time was being used wisely. So that was the first thing. Always make people feel like they're winning. The second thing they told us was that they stayed because they found their people. And, if you're organizing around gun safety in a really red state, it's not easy. You might feel isolated. You might feel alone. You might feel like there's no one who agrees with your position. And suddenly you're surrounded by dozens of women in your state who feel exactly the same way you do. Not even just about this issue, probably a lot of issues. And so when you find your people, you don't want to let them down. You want to keep showing up for them. And these are relationships, I refer to them in the book as bonfires, that will last your whole life.
So Okay, on those 2 points. The first one, I want to say, like in so many things that I've done now, even in my work on anti-Semitism, that feedback was so important because the algorithms and social media makes you believe that you have to constantly talk about how horrible everything is and look at this crazy bad thing and we have to fight this and it's actually not what people want to hear. When you gave me that feedback of focusing on the joy and the positive and the wins and unity and love, which is where I gravitate anyway, it actually was, we did so much better and we achieved so much more.
And joy is a big part of this.
Yeah.
Joy, I mean, you know, when we decided we would have an annual get together of our volunteers, it would be a weekend of training and gun violence survivor discussions. And we knew it was going to be heavy. And that first year, I said, I think at the very end, we should have a dance party, which was met with absolute silence. And there were a lot of people who thought that wasn't appropriate. It didn't meet the moment. It wasn't the right tone. And I said, like, after this heavy weekend, this is exactly what we need. We are going to need joy. And we turned off the lights and we had a DJ and people took off their shoes. One woman went to the hospital with a dancing injury. Swear to God. And it ended up being what they said in the responses was the most important part of the weekend to them. Yes, they learned a lot. Yes, they heard stories. Yes, they're going to keep doing this work. But when they came together in joy, it was important. And I think sometimes we forget that all parts of our life, personal, political, professional, it all should include joy. And I talked to you about this in the book. Mandana's in the book, obviously.
Okay, so then so the bonfire part. That was so important in the book, and I think it's also so important because we used to, when I used to have a podcast before, and I remember interviewing you, and you said to me, "What's so important about like finding your purpose and is that you find your people, right? And that when you sort of show up, and the purpose is like." What keeps you up at night? What do you care about? Just show up, take that first step, go to a meeting. And then who's at the meeting? Like those are, and through the work and through activism for me over the last 10 years, like I made you be my friend. I've found so many other amazing people. And like we would go on vacations with other of our friends that were activists and talk. And sometimes we're like, can we just talk about housewives? Like, can we not? Like, you don't want
to. That's Mandana saying that.
Yeah, of course, Shannon wouldn't. But just this idea that you can also have so many different layers and levels to your friendship and support each other through all these things. And then and then in the real moments, like when there were times where I was dark and Shannon would literally flew to LA and like yanked me by my ponytail. It's like, get back up. Like you are not this person. And even after on October 7th, my first phone call was Shannon. And she was like, this is a really hard day and you need to say something. Like people need to, like, you need to show up in this moment. And I couldn't talk. And I think so much about the power of this bonfire and accountability and holding each other up when like you literally can't stand on your own legs. And I've learned so much of that from you, but can you maybe share what that means to you?
Yeah, it's double-sided. So the first thing I would say is that you're right. When I mentioned finding your people and how important that is, there's nothing more valuable than finding like-minded people who, I fly all over the country for years to meet with Moms to Men Action volunteers. And I thought they'd known each other forever and they had just met through Moms to Men Action, but they were going to be friends forever. So I do think that's an important part of this, given polarization, given social media, given the pandemic. It is not easy right now to find your people. I think a lot of us are feeling very isolated. But the ironic part about this, and Maria actually published this piece by me, and I think the headline was something like, I found myself at 50 with no friends, which is, quite a headline to have out there about you.
I was like, what? Not that this is about me, but obviously.
But the interesting thing is I was so busy with my family and my career that with the exception of Mandana, I was listening to a podcast and the podcaster said, if you don't have 5 people you can call in the middle of the night with an emergency, you don't have enough close friends. And I was like, oh, phew, I have like 5 kids. Like, what is the point of having kids if you can't call them in the middle of the night? And then he was like, accept your children or accept your family. So I set out on this whole journey to make friends outside of Moms to Men Action too. People that I could call in the middle of the night. My husband is wonderful, but there's something different about being with women and the energy of being with women. And, I wrote this book, frankly, thinking Kamala Harris would be president when I was writing it. And I thought, what a great moment to convince women to run for office. And it ended up still meeting the moment in such a different way. Like there's no better time for women to figure out who they are and what makes them come alive and bring that to the world. We need that more than ever.
So I want to talk about like the book obviously is not just about people who want to become activists, right? It's really about people who want to find their fire. And that means so many different things in the book. But I guess I think sometimes it's hard to tell, like, this is just part of being an adult that sucks. And this is like, I hate my life in some way, right? Like, get me out of here. And I don't know, I guess, how do you sort of help people figure out when they need to find their fire, and how do you go about figuring that out?
So, I think the archetype for this book, there's kind of four. The first would be young women who are graduating from high school or college, who are trying to figure out who they are and don't want to go down the wrong path. And I think the part of this that's interesting is that you are in the book because, and so many of the women who I interviewed who are immigrants or their parents are immigrants said the same thing, which is, I can be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. That is my path, right? And they went way far down that path and decided they hated it. Like, you became a lawyer and didn't like it, and then they have to start all over again. So I think the book is good for women at that age so they can figure that out. Young women who are feeling overwhelmed by their family or career and want to still figure out time for themselves and pursuing their desires. Women like me who are empty nesters and finally have a whole new chapter in their lives and have more time to do what they want. And then women who are retired and who have all this wisdom to bring to the world. One of my favorite stories is there's a woman in the book named Carol Frick, and she wanted to be an author, and she ended up being a phys ed teacher for 30 years and retired, and then went to volunteer in an animal shelter. And at the animal shelter, she had this idea of a couple who falls in love there. And she goes home and she teaches herself how to write a book and how to write dialogue and writes the whole book, and then decides, I deserve to have this published. I don't want to self-publish. She sent it to 218 publishing houses and was rejected 218 times. On the 219th time, a man who likes dogs gave her a book deal. And she became a published author at age 70. And though, we hear so much, I think, right now about what women are doing, which is wonderful. My mom's generation, they were expected to sort of disappear, find a hobby, stay on the sidelines after their kids left for school. But I wanted this book to be about the how, not just the what, but how do you get there?
And so what is that?
It's really
yes, please.
It's really the formula, right? And so it's full of exercises and journal prompts to help you figure out what your abilities are. So many women downplay their abilities. I've seen this time and again. So listing all of your abilities, even did you throw a successful birthday party? Like, we call those pejoratively soft skills. Those are badass skills, right? Those are skills that are important. And then asking other people what they think your abilities are, because that's very surprising to a lot of people. And then deciding, okay, if there's certain skills that you need, you can go acquire those. So that's one big piece of this formula. The other is figuring out what your values are, because if you do want to get involved in something professionally, personally, politically, you need to know what is your North Star at this time in your life. I just did an event with Brene Brown, the guiding light of personal values, and there are thousands, right? But what are yours? And then the last thing is desires. What are the dormant desires that you have? And really the thesis for this book is that men are taught to fulfill their desires and women are taught to fulfill their obligations. We have so many shoulds that become, I call them false fires. We start to think that there are actual desires, but they're actually things that society expects and wants us to do. And I'm not saying don't do those, although if you don't do them. But I do think that women don't fear their fire because they're weak. It's because they're wise. We know the system is set up to put obstacles in our way at all times. Imagine what would happen if women asked themselves, what do I want? Institutions would crumble, governments would fall, family systems would fall apart, right? There's a reason that we don't ask ourselves, what do I want? And the last thing I would say about that is that I think women should be thinking about what is our legacy. And when I ask women that, when I was interviewing the book, everyone said, oh, that's such a loaded word. That's so scary to me, legacy, like it's your name on the side of a building or a philanthropy. It's not. It's just meaning that you got to the end of your life and know that you burned, that you lived a life that was authentic to you. And every woman deserves to do that.
What's your tattoo?
I got an 11. I got that in Santa Barbara. Yes. I got my first tattoo. When I asked myself, what do I want that day? It was like peanut butter ice cream and a tattoo.
This was like last week. That's why. Yeah, look, I think like me as someone, as an immigrant who was raised, in this country, trying to adapt, assimilate, it's really hard to disentangle from the shoulds, because I don't know, like I actually have no idea what I want. And then there were so many sections in this book where I was like, okay, maybe this can be my own personal mini therapy session. But like you talk about imposter syndrome, which I still possess and I've been working on for so long, and I don't know how to, like, did I make it? Like, what does that even mean? What does that mean, right? And I think this chasing of achievement to feel like, okay, it was worth it, whatever this experience or coming to America was for. And then you write about like busyness, which is like, I'm the busiest person you've ever met. And I'm just like, give me more. I'm going to launch a new thing. In the middle of one launch, I've started the next 3 launches. And anyone who's working with me is in this room smiling. She's nodding her head. And that like prevents me from having to deal with a lot of things I don't want to deal with, and questions I don't want to answer that you highlight in the book. And I was like, ooh, fuck, she's calling me out. And it's real when you see it in black and white in your book, and you're like, oh, I'm doing this, and this. And so I like, how do you get past those things, or how do you work through those things?
There's 2 things. So the first, I talk a lot in the book about what are false fires. When E. Brodsky, if you read the book Fair Play, I interview her for the book, and she talks about the fact that women are sometimes CIYOO, complicit in your own oppression. We start to think these false fires are actually our desires, and those often look like purpose. This idea that we're all born for one big purpose and we just haven't found it yet, and we spend our whole lives looking for it. It's been commodified in many ways, right? Like self-care. The second is happiness, this unachievable feeling that we're supposed to feel all the time, no matter what we're doing. And busyness, and I'm very guilty of this myself. If we're busy, then we're somehow productive, and that's our purpose. And so that's one piece of it, is delineating your false fires from your true fires. But the other piece of this, I have so many women say to me, I just wish I would have been prepared for the blowback. And so I wanted this to be a handbook, because you will face blowback, right? You may not get threats of death and sexual violence like I did from gun extremists, but you may get the snarky comment in the pickup line at your kid's school, or your mother-in-law may say something, when you miss a dinner. And that kind of blowback, especially for women, triggers guilt and shame, right? Guilt being I did a bad thing, shame being I am bad. And then it makes us, I talk about these as extinguishers in the book. It makes us go into these ways of behaving that are just, sometimes we don't even see them. It's self-sabotage, whether it's a desire to disappear, or people pleasing, or perfectionism, martyring yourself, which I talk about at length in the book. I didn't take any pay for 11 years. I gave all my book proceeds away. I gave all my speaking proceeds away. 11 years, while all the other people in the organization, the men, got paid. And I think in retrospect, I had to think about this a lot when I was writing the book. I was trying to be a good girl. Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm sharp elbowed, and I'm really, calling people out online, but I'm a good girl because I'm not taking any money. And I think we fall into these different ways of behaving, and knowing it is half the battle, because blowback is predictable and none of it is personal. I also think your ability to live on fire is directly proportional to the amount of blowback that you can withstand. And so being able to start feeling those feelings, I give 3 specific ways you can handle blowback, and I go into depth in them. But the first is really deciding if you value the person who's giving you this feedback. Mm-hmm. So often we take everyone's feedback personally and internalize it. And I mean, do you really care what a gun extremist thinks about what you're saying? Mm-hmm. The second way is to reframe what people are saying. And I interview Sharon Salzberg and Kristen Neff and these other experts in meditation and self-compassion. How do you make those feelings more palatable and live with them in your body? And then the third is to remember that you're a role model. There's a virtuous circle when you set an example of being able to withstand blowback, and you encourage other women to do the same.
Yeah, I remember talking to you about this too, because I feel like I grew up as such a people pleaser my whole life. Like, all I wanted was to be perfect. Like, and part of that was being an immigrant and coming here and being like, oh, I should act like this, and this means I'm perfect. And when I started I'm a Voter, I knew that half the people in my life were going to be very unhappy with me. And it was the scariest thing I ever did. And it also felt the most alive. It was the first time I felt like free. I was like, this is what people feel like when they go like skydiving. Like this was so liberating. I was just like, I am free of all of this shit. I am myself. I don't even care. And then like 5 days later, I was like, oh my God, this is really scary. The blowback is really hard.
Yes.
It's very real and it hurts.
You had to
and
like
you have,
sit down with your dad and tell him you
oh
didn't
my
want to
God.
be a lawyer.
All those things.
Yeah.
Really hard. Really, really
Yeah.
hard. So what does it mean, I guess, when you talk about to come alive, you should build a life from the inside out, not the outside in?
It's just this idea of we internalize so much of the external messaging and the things that we're told we should be and we should do, and instead deciding that for ourselves and living that way from the inside out. And it's just, it's a nuance, but I think if we thought about that more, like the idea of asking yourself, what do I want every day? Am I living in a way that is what people think I should be doing as opposed to what I want to be doing?
Okay, we're almost at time. I have just 2 more quick, I promise. Okay. You quote Professor Caitlin Collins saying, guilt serves as a regulatory mechanism because it benefits men, employers, and the government for women to feel guilty. You continue by saying, you need to give all the fucks, you need to give 0 fucks, and the degree to which you grow your fire is directly proportional to the amount of blowback you're willing and able to withstand. And I know we just talked about some of those things, but I think when I read this, I also was thinking so much about this idea of us going into this and thinking like, am I unqualified? How do I step into this with the power, right? And like, how do I know that I know what you know what I mean? Like there were so many questions that I think people feel when they go into these things, feeling like they've been told their whole lives, like stay in your lane. You're supposed to do this. You're an accountant. Like that's what you do for a living. And you always try to encourage people like, no. You were made for all of these other moments and think about all the other things that you're qualified to do. And so how do you sort of walk people through those moments?
Well, the first thing, and I'm sorry, Maria Shriver, saying fuck in front of you. I feel really bad about that. But I write in the book about the double bind of fucks for women.
She had to watch White Lotus.
So it's this idea that, women have to give all the fucks. We have to care about our families and our communities and the world and be so in it and just like care so much. And then we have to give 0 fucks. We have to care absolutely nothing about what people say about us or think about us, or we will never move forward. We have to be both soft and hard in the world. And that is really hard. And as I say in the book, I don't have a solution for it other than be prepared for that and understand that's what is expected of us. What I'm amazed by is that women are taking this book and they're starting real life bonfires where they live in over 30 states so far, where they are getting together to talk about personal, political, and professional empowerment. I think those conversations are important. I don't think you can live on fire without a community. We have something called Firestarter University. So if you bought a book, you can enroll at firedupbook.com. We have 800 women who are signed up already. And these are your people. This is your bonfire. We're going to do a year-long online program with a lot of women for the book and have discussions. But I think, the book is all about figuring out what is your fire formula? How do I endure the blowback? How do I get through the messy middle? How do I find my people? And then how do I keep trying this formula, right? Marrying your abilities, values, and desires over and over again, knowing it's a practice. Some might start no fires, some might start little fires, some might start big fires. And then when it comes time, how do you put that out and begin again?
She's so amazing. This is why I made her be my friend. I have 50 other questions, but do you want to do audience questions for a minute? And then I'll take back whenever people don't want it.
I was wondering, how do you juggle interests and passions? At least for me, I'm somebody who has way too many interests and wants to do all of them at some point. How do you navigate that and prioritize ones that you should do first, or things that are more on the hobby category, things like that?
Yeah. I think, first of all, I'm so glad that you have that. That's amazing to begin with. And those are all things you should be able to do until the end of your life, right? And I think when you go through the formula practice, some of them will come to the forefront and some will fade to the back. you don't have to start a big organization. You don't have to start a company, right? This is maybe just having a hard conversation or asking for a promotion or deciding to try out this hobby that you mentioned. And all of them are about coming alive and figuring out who you are and what you want and the people that you're going to meet through that. So I don't know that you have to get rid of any of them, but maybe it's more like going through the formula process, figuring out which ones rise to the top, and then putting the others on the back burner, but always getting to them in some way. I just got a certificate in genealogy from Boston University, right? I mean, it's completely random, makes no sense. It's a non sequitur, but I loved it. So,
I didn't even know you did that.
my kids didn't even know that I did that.
Yeah, because you opened your book with that whole story about basically confronting that you just weren't happy in your marriage.
Yes.
And I think for so many people, that's one of the hardest, like just confronting this idea that like it's fine, but it's not what I want anymore.
You know, I mean, my mom's generation, you had to stay married no matter what. And I got married right out of college to my college sweetheart. I had 3 kids by the time I was 29 years old. And I sort of woke up in my 30s and realized if my brain had been fully developed, this is not probably the person I would have married. And I'm sure he feels the same way. And I had to make a choice, right? Like it comes down to, what do I want? Do I want to stay in this marriage the rest of my life and be unfulfilled, or do I want to figure out another way forward? And I write about in the book, I was in an emergency room covered with eczema, and the doctor was like, how much stress are you under? And that just opened the floodgates. And I kind of had to write my way out of it. I couldn't afford a therapist at the time. I couldn't confide in my husband. And that's why the book is full of so many journal prompts, because I do think there is, and data actually shows this, there's something very valuable about writing about what do I want, who am I, what do I need, what is not working, what is. And if you're not keeping a journal, you know, I think I highly recommend it. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Anybody else? Yeah.
Can you talk a bit more about what you described as the messy middle and how you maintain this part, especially maybe a year or 2 years in when it's not new anymore, but you haven't necessarily achieved as much as you wanted to?
Yeah, I interview so many women who are in the messy middle. One of the women was in her 50s and decided to go to Harvard's divinity school, which is no cakewalk. I mean, that is a very, very hard degree. And she moved to Boston, was away from her family and was commuting for 2 years. And right in the middle decided, you know, she didn't know if she could do it. And I just think it's really important to hear the stories of other women who've tried these things and gone through the messy middle and gotten through to the other side. But I give all different kinds of examples and tips. And I think one of them is just continuing to have a growth mindset. Like that's the biggest part of this, which is what am I learning? What am I getting out of this? How do I get to the other side? That is not to say you shouldn't give up. There are plenty of things that we do that we realize right in the middle, this isn't what I had hoped it would be. And it is okay to give up. But if you're giving up just because it's hard and it's still what you really want, then the book is full of tips for like, how do you get through to the other side?
When we went to your event in Santa Barbara, my husband, Peter, who's in the back, came. He was like, every man needs to read this book. He listened to this conversation, and not with me, but with someone else. And he's like, I learned the most about you through listening to Shannon than I have in the longest time, because you don't realize what you're dealing with and what you're going through. And there's just, it was really cool. So Peter's going to start your men's book club.
Peter, be a men's bonfire.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That would be great. Any other questions?
Oh,
Yes.
Okay. So I would like to first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
So,
Can I tell really quickly how this happened?
well, the first
Yes,
thing to
okay,
say
go.
it is so much work to put a book out, right? And to sell a book, to believe in a book, and to get it on the New York Times bestseller list. So I hope that you are basking in this moment, not just running through it, but actually allowing it to land for yourself. Because
Thank
it's
you.
such a huge birthing, and it's such a huge achievement.
Thank you.
So I want to say that. And the other thing is, you said in the conversation that you thought it was super important for women today to step into their fire now more than ever, was what you said. And I'd love for you to expand on why you think that is, that this moment
Yep.
is made for women of all ages?
Yeah.
What is it about this moment, and what do women actually bring to this moment that's different?
Yeah. So I want to say really quickly that I had just stepped back from Moms Demand Action, and I was thinking about taking a year-long break, maybe becoming a master gardener. And I was running on the treadmill, and I looked down at my phone. It says Maria Shriver, and as one does, I hit the emergency stop button and answered the phone, and that's how I ended up writing a book for Maria's imprint, The Open Field. So thank you very much for this opportunity. You know,
You said, I don't think I have a book. Let me think about it. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm like, no, I'm sure.
thank you for making me a fire starter. I appreciate that. You know, as I said, I thought I was writing this for a different moment. I was very certain that Kamala Harris would be president, and yet here we are in a very different moment. Women only make up about 25% of the 500,000 elected positions in this country. We only make up about 5% of the Fortune 1000 CEOs. And so we are not making the policies that protect our families and our communities and the country. And as the saying goes, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. And right now, women are very much on the menu in this country. And so it is really incredibly important that we are figuring out how to bring our values, our abilities, and our desires to the world. And again, that doesn't have to be activism. I want to get to that in a second. I mean, it can be professionally, it can be personally. When you start to come alive, you start to be courageous and brave, and you encourage other women to do the same. And that is what this moment is all about, right? There's no quick fix to what we're going through. It is going to be a long game. It is going to be incremental. It is all about building a foundation. And I get questions a lot about, like, is it even worth doing right now? Is you know, I feel hopeless or I feel helpless. I think a lot about the women who started suffrage and the fact that they were beaten and starved and imprisoned and never saw the fruits of their labor. 100 years later, only did all women get the right to vote. And yet what they did laid the foundation and created freedom and safety for generations of people. And I think we have to think of our activism and democracy the same way. The other thing about democracy is that I think it's like a sick child. So if your kid is up all night and throwing up, you don't look at them at 3 a.m. and say, wow, you know, you don't feel good, but I'm exhausted and I will see you at 8 a.m. Let me know how it's going. You hold that kid's hand all night until they're better. And I think democracy is the same way. And so given that women right now have to pull the levers of power that we have that exist, we have to pull all of them. And we have to come together in community to do that.
You know, it's funny because I think so much about like in the time of Amazon Prime, right? Like everyone thinks that everything happens in like the next day or like in 2 days. So I talk to so many voters all the time that are like, but I voted and the thing didn't happen. So like, I'm done. And I was like, what do you mean you're done? You can't just vote in one election and like, you're done with democracy. And I was in response to that, I guess, can you sort of explain your drips on a rock metaphor?
Yeah. People get so frustrated by incrementalism. It's kind of a dirty word in this country, especially among young people. And I totally get it. It's young people's role to push against older generations and demand change. That's important. But when you're older and you have more wisdom, you realize that the system is not set up for overnight change. I would have been master gardening for the last 10 years if that were the case, right? The system is set up for incremental change, but it is incremental change that leads to revolutions. I've seen it over and over again in my own activism and in this country. And so remembering that, yes, it's a marathon, not a sprint. It's also a relay race. You can pass the baton to other people when you need to step back, and you should do that. I've done that. But Alice Walker talks about in her quote that activism is the rent I pay to live on the planet. And I just don't think anyone can afford to sit on the sidelines right now. Waking up every day to be hopeful is a choice. Waking up every day to be hopeless is a choice. I often have seen that hopelessness is cynicism. It's an excuse for inaction. We all have to every morning wake up and find ways to be hopeful and to get involved.
Sorry, Brooke.
And I just like a follow-up in terms of, I'm sure a lot of people in this room feel that like we have these bright fires and sparks and we want to burn brightly, we want to pull all the levers and we want to be hopeful, we want to do all the things. But you know, you mentioned the dance party, the mom's dance party. And I'm just so curious in this space in your life, in the throes of everything else, like what does joy look like for you, and how do you give yourself permission to rest amid the lever pulling?
Of course, you'd ask me the hardest question for me
Your
personally.
dogs,
Yes.
traveling, candy corn.
Yeah, candy corn is a big part of it. I do think that is also a little bit of a discipline. Like if we think about things as a practice, joy is part of that, and finding joy in your life. I just got off of 3 weeks of book tour, and my husband said, I'm planning a vacation. And I said, great, what is it? And he said, we wake up every day at 5:30 and hike for 4 hours. And then we work out more. And then, I was like, okay, that sounds like torture, not a vacation. But it was actually beautiful and really joyful to be with him and to be out in nature. And that's, for me, really joyful. So I think it is figuring out ways to plan it. Like I plan the dance party, right? Thinking ahead, planning for, okay, I've got all this work. Maybe it's professional, maybe it's personal, maybe it's political, but I am going to find moments in my life for that. And if we don't have that, you will burn out. You will not want to keep doing the things you're doing unless you have something in mind. What is your joy, Brooke?
Spending my time with this guy, hanging with my girlfriends, my huddle, my bonfire.
Yes, you wrote a book called Huddle, all about women friendship.
You and Lucy, and then just traveling, being curious.
Yeah, being curious is a good one.
Any other questions? Maybe we can do some book signings? Okay, amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing.